All right, welcome everyone to another live stream webinar. My name is Bobby Gill. I am here representing the Savory Institute, and today we are celebrating Earth Day, and we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Richard Teague. If you follow the research behind holistic management and holistic planned grazing, you have surely read his papers, and so he's got a really great presentation for us today. Just want to go in to a little bit of housekeeping before we get started and before I bring Richard on. We are live streaming today to both Facebook and YouTube. So what that means is Richard is going to give his talk for about 20 or 30 minutes. And then after that, we are going to open it up to audience Q&A. Now, when we open it up to audience Q&A, what's going to happen is your chat from Facebook and YouTube is going to show up here on the side of the screen. So you can type something here and say, hey there, and it'll show up on the screen. I'm going to turn that off for now because we don't want to have distractions during Richard's talk. We want to be able to see everything full screen, but hold your questions until that Q&A portion at the end. So I'm going to turn off that chat now. Going to go over a quick bio real quick. So Dr. Richard Teague was raised in a farming community in Rhodesia, or what is now Zimbabwe. He attended university in South Africa. From 1972 until his retirement earlier this year, Dr. Teague has been a research scientist at Texas A&M, working on the regenerative management of rangelands. The purpose of his research at A&M has been to conduct a ranch-scale, multi-state assessment that addresses two related objectives in the context of the climate change mitigation and adaptation to determine, one, how grazing strategies influence key ecosystem services, soil fertility and stability, water quality, net primary and secondary production, and the economic viability of working ranches in the USA, and two, the extent that different grazing management strategies can be used by livestock producers to mitigate and adapt to alternative climate change scenarios. To accomplish this, his team has partnered with farmers who have improved the environment and excel financially using a systems science, multidiscipline framework to find the best grazing management for regenerating soil health and function, delivering ecosystem goods and services, and improving farmer livelihoods and social resilience. That is a mouthful, and without further ado, I'd like to bring up our guest for the day, Dr. Richard Teague. Richard, how are you, sir?
Very good, thank you.
All right. Oh, I still see that we have a little "we will begin shortly" graphic showing up, so we will not be beginning shortly. Let's take that away. Well, Richard, thank you so much for being here today. It's truly an honor to have you. I know everyone at the Savory Institute and throughout the Savory Global Network is such a big fan of your work, and we're so grateful for all that you do to study this and publish. I hear that you have recently retired. Is that true?
That is true.
What before we kick off into your talk, just give folks a little peek at what's coming next for Dr. Richard Teague in his retirement years.
Well, I still enjoy this subject immensely. It's my life. And I've always wanted to be a practicing holistic management person. And I'm in the process of buying a small ranch that I'm going to run holistically and carry on working and helping the youngsters who are starting wherever I can.
That's so incredible. I get to travel around and visit holistic managers all around the world. Maybe I'll get to come visit you, which will be fantastic.
You'd be welcome.
All right. Well, I don't want to take up any more time. I want to make sure that folks get a chance to hear what you have to say today, talking over the science. So if you want to bring up your slides and put those into present mode, I will then bring those onto the screen. And it looks like you are in present mode. So I'm going to bring up your slides and I'm going to disappear. And Richard, take it away.
Good afternoon and greetings from Texas. It's indeed a pleasure to present results from grazing research we've been conducting over a number of decades. And I thank you very much for the invitation. In many of our papers, we use the term Adaptive Multi-Paddock or AMP grazing. I want to assure the listeners that this is entirely synonymous with holistic planned grazing. And we've used AMP because it gets less vitriol from the scientific community. So that's the only reason we've done that. It's well known that carbon-rich soil is beneficial for the entire ecosystem. And our goal in our research has been to restore soil carbon and ecological function, the delivery of ecosystem goods and services, and improve farmer livelihoods and social resilience, should I say. So when we began, the first thing we did was go to the NRCS, who does the mapping right around the US, and we approached the people in Texas and asked them, please introduce us to the ranchers who have the highest soil organic carbon that you have encountered. And without exception, the highest organic carbon, wherever we looked, was with Holistic Planned Grazing. And that kicked us off into having that as the focus to see how well it performed versus the kind of grazing that people generally practiced. So I just want to begin by saying that many scientists around the world think that we are untruthful or totally biased in our research. But I want to show you that the reason why we have achieved different results from most scientists. Carbon levels prior to the Europeans coming to the US were very high. And after conventional grazing began, organic carbon quickly declined, as did the functional effectiveness of the ecosystems. And it was only generally about 30 years ago when regenerative grazing began with holistic management, basically, and other similar ones, that in fact we saw a significant actually improvement. Most researchers have worked on areas that have not been subject to regenerative grazing. So they have not recorded carbon, they have only recorded in degraded situations, and then they've only measured to about 30 centimeters, 1 foot. Consequently, they have not determined the amount of carbon that can be fixed with improved grazing. Our research has been conducted on ranches where the regenerative grazing has been conducted for 20 to 30 years generally, and we've always also measured to 1 meter in depth where we can, and not just to 8 inches or a foot in most scientific studies. And this gives us a much better idea of the amount of carbon that's in the ground. And this is why our results differ so substantially from those elsewhere. So in rangelands, as in most of agriculture, the biggest limiting factor of rangelands is not the amount of rain you get, but the amount of water that actually enters the soil. On the right is a picture on the ranch that was taken on the left-hand side after it had been managed with holistic planned grazing for 15 to 20 years. And on the left side was very little vegetation because of constant grazing pressure. You had a lot of water runoff, erosion, etc., and very little function of the ecosystem. And that has changed radically just due to the holistic planned grazing management. Now, 90% of the soil function is mediated by microbes. And the microbes depend on the plants, and the plants depend on the microbes. So how we manage the plants is absolutely critical. And that's at the center of how to use holistic planned grazing principles to make it work well. To make a system work as well as it can, we have to make every management decision improve 4 key ecological functions. Those are the 4 up there. First, you need to capture energy that drives the system. That's the fuel that drives it. We also have to make sure that water is getting in the ground so the plants can actually function and the soil can function. And we have to maintain mineral cycling at high levels so that the limited number of nutrients in the ecosystem can actually recycle and perform their functions again and again. And to do that, we have to manage so that the right plants perform the community dynamics that creates this functioning ecosystem. So the microbes and fungi are absolutely essential to, first of all, soil structure, to allow water to get in the ground, improve the nutrient access for plants, extend root volume and depth, and produce exudates, increase water and nutrient retention, and plant growth is the highest when you've got a very high level of fungi in the soil because they perform so many positive things. And they fend off pests and pathogens. It's quite easy to manage in a way that destroys all these functions, but by making sure that they work properly, you result in very high levels of productivity. Another great friend of ours is the earthworm. They're amongst our most beneficial organisms. They provide soil channels that enhance water infiltration. And the best fertilizer in the world is earthworm feces. And we need to manage to make them thrive. We need to cover the soil and make sure the soil microbial population is functioning and there's organic matter for them to feed on. Similarly, dung beetles are an absolute key for improving infiltration, facilitating other soil microbes, and in recycling nutrients and decreasing insects that bother the livestock. And much of the research that I've outlined there covers this extremely well and is included in many of our publications. 200 cows can drop 25 tons of dung a week and increase infiltration by 130%. And by concentrating the animals, you allow the dung beetles to concentrate on the recently deposited dung and then move around after the cattle to keep the thing going, much as they would have done in the evolving ecosystems under bison, etc. So let us look now at a situation, 3,000 acres here in Texas, and the green dots are GPS points of cattle grazing through the year. And you'll notice that they don't spread evenly. They overuse certain areas and underuse others. And they create damage in certain areas and decrease ecosystem function in others. Research is generally conducted on much smaller acreages than is found on most commercial ranches, judged by these yellow squares. And no matter how many or where you put those squares, you're not going to pick up the true impacts of the effect in the over the landscape. So under continuous grazing, on the light continuous you see left, plants are selected and overused, so they have shallow roots, and other plants next to them are underused, so they shade out the grasses. And this has negative consequences. If you do that for long enough, the situation on the right becomes into play where what used to be short grass after a drought with no roots or shallow roots, they become bare ground. And slowly the process of increasing bare ground increases, decreasing the overall area. So holistic planned grazing, we put in adequate water points so that you get a general grazing right over the whole area. You split the area into many small paddocks and you graze one at a time, the right amount for the purposes at hand and situation, so that you don't overgraze at any particular time and you allow a suitable recovery, a long period of recovery before the next grazing. And this allows the animals to select more of the whole landscape, evening out the grazing pressure and allowing recovery after the each defoliation, and a much wider variety of plant species is consumed. So an example is provided by early work done at the Noble Foundation in southern Oklahoma on tallgrass prairie that indicates what can be achieved at low cost with huge benefits. Project started with a farm having moderately graded native grazing land and few good species with a lot of weeds. You can see a couple of taller grasses in there, beneficials, but a lot of ragweed and stuff like that that doesn't materially add to productivity, particularly under low-density grazing. What they did is they provided us a water point and divided it into 18 paddocks and grazed each paddock to improve the plant species, a light to moderate use and not regrazing until recovery had taken place. The net effect was that from 1988 to 97, you got a huge number of increase in the number of unit grazing days as the plant population increased. There's a couple of dips in there that happens in the normal cycle of droughts and rainy seasons. But generally over that period, there's very nearly a fourfold increase in a number of animals that can be carried with correct level of grazing. So this was actually achieved by holistic planned grazing, which aims to improve ecological function as the basis to increase profits. So you need flexible stocking to match forage availability and animal numbers, spread the grazing over the whole ranch, defoliate moderately in the growing season so that you don't diminish the ability of plants to produce, use short grazing periods that are good for cattle and for the plants to recover, and then, very importantly, allow adequate recovery before regrazing. And these need to be adjusted as forage growth rates change. You have to slow things down when growth is slow and speed things up when they are not. So let's look at the causal mechanisms, and these are what we hypothesized would actually be the case. And this is the foundation of the hypothesis that we were testing in all our research. If you take holistic planned grazing, light continuous, heavy continuous, and no grazing, and you look bottom left at energy flow, water cycle, mineral cycle, and soil plant diversity, holistic planned grazing is good in every single one of those. Light continuous grazing is low on light, not too bad on some of the things, but your mineral cycling diminishes rapidly. No grazing causes many problems because by not grazing at all, you are actually eliminating many of the functions of this evolved grazing ecosystem. So just to summarize that, if you look at each one, energy flow, HPG, by far the superior. The hydrological function, very, very high on HPG, and also high on no grazing. With mineral cycling, the only thing that was really high is holistic planned grazing, low on the continuous grazing, and extremely low on the no grazing situation. And in terms of community dynamics to support function, holistic planned grazing, the highest by far, moderate on moderate continuous, poor and very poor on the other two. And that basically sums up. And we've been testing those hypotheses and found them to be correct in all our research. So we then started a research at 3 contiguous counties in North Texas on southern tallgrass prairie. And we compared heavy continuous grazing with light continuous grazing and holistic planned grazing. The HPG gave 3 tons carbon per hectare per year more sequestering than the usual heavy continuous grazing. We improved soil microbe composition, the water and soil fertility improved with HPG, and we improved plant species composition and production. And livestock production was greatly increased. It's quite odd when you go to each one of these ranches, you would see on the holistic planned grazing far more grass than on any of the other treatments, and yet they had double or triple the number of stock there. So a testimony to how successful it was. So on the strength of this, those are our results there. In North Texas, we wanted to see what happens further north, where it is cooler and drier, to the west, where it's much drier, and then to the east, where it's much wetter and warmer. So the results we got from our first initial conceptual examination was similar result, just a little bit less up in the north than we are. In the dry country, New Mexico, substantially less, as you'd expect from a very much drier and slightly cooler environment. So you get less there, but the same things were happening. And then later studies, we've been working across the Mississippi, and 3 studies Alan Williams, Megan Machmuller, and Sam Mosier just recently published extraordinary amounts of extra carbon over the neighbours that we measured. So, because this is not an exact measurement, we've assumed a time difference, and that the neighbour and holistic planned grazing places were similar before we started. We used more sophisticated CO2 isotope sampling to determine the exact amounts of carbon being fixed at any particular time. And very similar results we got there. We found out that 3 tons per hectare with those instantaneous measurements, confirming the rest of our study. So on the strength of that, we got some substantial funding from both the government and matched with from McDonald's to do a much more in-depth study with more disciplines, 14 disciplines, and a team of 20 scientists. First, down on the bottom right in the southeast, you'll see the locations there: Kentucky, Tennessee, North Alabama, Mid-Alabama, and then Mississippi. And we measured all of these things with a group of scientists. And we've had excellent results. So the most recent things, and the prime thing that we were looking at, is to see what effects on the soil organic carbon and soil nitrogen stocks were building up in those 5 locations in east of the Mississippi. So on the left-hand side, there's a grazing type, AMP or HPG versus CG in red, and you'll see that the carbon stocks were much higher after just 7 years of HPG grazing. And even though the AMP grazers had no additions of inorganic fertilizers, and the regular grazing of the neighbor did add amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus, you will see that the amount of nitrogen available in the soil was still high with AMP. And we believe that is because we restored the biological production of the fertility. So everything was working substantially better. Let me go back one. So at the bottom there, you'll see that the very important thing is the long-term fraction, MAOM, was greater at all depths with holistic planned grazing. So this is a very substantial and sustainable productivity. So Alan Williams, in his various partners that he's worked with, also east of the Mississippi, you'll see all the states there. And then year 1, they implemented holistic planned grazing and then followed it each year for 5 years. Now you'll see they all started off at a different point, but there's a remarkable similarity in the rate of gain of the organic carbon after the beginning of holistic planned grazing. And it's quite interesting that the mean for the top 8 inches indicated an increase of 8.6 tons of carbon per year relative to where they started. And as I said earlier in my earlier slide, if you measured to a greater depth, you almost certainly would have recorded a greater amount of total carbon stock additions. So the other thing that's really important is the biology is driving what's going on. And Alan Williams and his people sampling, they recorded, compared to year 1 and year 5, the microbial biomass increased remarkably. And this is the driver of the improvements that we've measured. Now, the key thing in all of these places is the infiltration of heavy continuous grazing versus holistic planned grazing. And these are from up at the Northern Great Plains and into Canada work that we were doing. And you'll see, with only 2 exceptions, the HPG had substantially higher infiltration rates. The other 2, the Holtman Ranch was very, very dry, had been dry for many years. So there was a more limited response. And on the cross ranch, they were particularly permeable soils. So even the poor grazing had not diminished the amount of infiltration that had occurred. So coming now to the larger watershed scale, this is a watershed that's been monitored in. You see the bottom right there in Denton, North Texas. And you'll see over 100 miles distance the size of the area. The dark green is native grazing. The yellow is winter wheat that is grazed, and the dark green is native woodland forest. So we had the numbers of stock available from 1980 to 2013 on every single farm in that catchment area. And we tested the watershed model that they had against the amount of runoff and amount of soil carbon and nitrogen coming into the water stream and phosphorus coming into the water stream as measured in Denton. And the results showed that HC on the left, heavy continuous, the surface runoff was very high. The light continuous was a bit lower, the losses. The holistic planned grazing and the grazing exclosure were no different from each other. So the HPG, even though it carried more animals, it was still functioning as well as the ungrazed areas from a watershed point of view, runoff. And then the infiltration was the exact converse of that, HC the lowest, and the HPG and the exclosure being the highest. Then looking at the nitrogen loads, the baseline, comparing against the four different treatments, and you'll see the HPG and the exclosures were much higher than the other treatments. And phosphorus, sorry, let me go back. Phosphorus actually showed exactly the same response. So one of the things that we're very concerned about, because everybody attacks cattle that are the major tool to get HPG working well to restore ecosystem services, is the emissions due to the cows, due to the rumen function. So what we did was we measured the amount of sequestration that had taken place in HC, LC, and HPG. The emissions by the cattle are in red, and you'll see LC at lower stocking is lower than the other two, which were at about the same level. And the green is the amount that we measured that was sequestered in the soil. And you'll see that all of them have a sequestered amount that substantially is greater than the amount that's emitted. And subsequent work in the Northern Great Plains has just backed that up. So the other work done is many feedlot people maintain that feeding cattle in the feedlots makes for more efficiency because cattle are on the land for a shorter period of time before they go for harvesting. So on the left-hand side there we've got, but most people forget to take into account the amount that the well-managed grassland is actually sequestering. On the left it shows the soil carbon flux without taking into account the amount that's sequestered, and you'll see that indeed what the feedlot people maintain is that the carbon footprint is lower with the feedlot cattle, but as soon as you look at the offset of the amount that's sequestered with those two things, exactly the reverse takes place, and you've got a very substantial negative carbon footprint when you take into account the amount that is sequestered. So this doesn't just have applicability to grazing lands and range lands. The people like Gabe Brown who've incorporated holistic planned grazing into their crop rotations has come up with very similar results. So tillage on its own in cropping systems creates a very negative soil function. situation. Moving to no-till improves it substantially. No-till with crop diversity actually improves things more. And then no-till with higher crop diversity involving many more species improves it substantially again, all because of the positive effects on the soil microbial function. And by having no-till and high crop diversity with mixed cover crops, which are very, very potent in terms of improving soil function. And then when you add holistically planned grazing to that whole mix, everything just jumps up much more because the cattle just have a very potent positive effect on improving the soil function if they are managed appropriately. So in summary, our HPG, or AMP versus continuous grazing, shows adaptive stocking is less sensitive to heavy stocking than fixed stocking. As the number of paddocks is increased, stocking rates can be increased while improving ecological function, because you can decrease the amount of grazing time and increase the amount of recovery time, and that combination is particularly effective. Holistic planned grazing advantage over continuous grazing increases with a greater number of stock numbers as the stock numbers increase and paddock numbers increase for the very same reasons. Short grazing periods and long recovery with greater than 30 paddocks per herd allows much higher stocking rates that gives maximum regeneration of ecological function, and we found that this is true everywhere we've measured it, and also gives higher net returns with much lower income variability. And income variability is one of the main things that hurts farmers. If you can diminish the variability from year to year, you've got a much more stable economic situation. One of the things we found, which we suspected and have hypothesized, is that net profits are proportional to the soil carbon levels and the soil health and soil function. If you manage to improve your soil function, you are going to improve your profits, all other things being equal. So to conclude, holistic planned grazing builds soil carbon and microbial function, enhances water infiltration and retention, it builds soil fertility, controls erosion more effectively, enhances watershed hydrological function, improves livestock production and economic returns while improving the resource space, enhances wildlife and biodiversity enormously with many, many benefits that I haven't even mentioned, but they are real. And it also increases soils as a net greenhouse gas sink, primarily due to repairing the water cycle, since the amount of gaseous water vapor is 90% of the heating effect of greenhouse gases. And that is improved vastly by improving the amount of soil carbon. We have many friends in many different organizations that have helped us with this, and I thank you very much, and would be glad to help answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Richard, thank you so much. Really great to see that all laid out. You know, I think one of the pieces that a lot of us in this space get a lot of the time is, for some reason, people asking, where is the science? And it should be obvious there is a lot of science. I often wonder if it's because people are, searching online and in the journals for, the term holistic management versus the term that you and your colleagues use when publishing, as you mentioned, which is adaptive multi-paddock grazing. But just to show folks a little bit, if they are interested in finding more of your research, and we'll get to these questions here in just one second. If you are interested in learning more about Richard's work. Savory has a science library. If you go to savory.global/science-library, you'll be able to go here and, you can search for holistic planned grazing. This will show most of Richard's work. You can search other categories. You could also just search Teague and search here, and everything will pop up. So anyways, I will stop sharing that. But now I think let's dive into the questions. I will say that during the presentation, we had an issue with YouTube for some reason. I think our YouTube stream got cut out. There was some sort of connection. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the chat on and cross my fingers that it works, that the chats from YouTube and Facebook will show up on the screen. So for everyone on YouTube and Facebook, if you could please type in a question or a comment there. I want to see if they show up here on the screen. And while we wait for that, I'm going to kick things off and just ask, now that you're retired, you mentioned there's this younger crop of researchers that are coming up. There's Paige Stanley, who was at Berkeley. I think now she's at CSU. Hannah Gosnell has been posting publishing a lot of good stuff. What are you looking forward to seeing out of this new generation of research as it relates to holistic planned grazing and AMP grazing?
That's a very good question. We approached this by going and looking at what had been achieved on the ground after HPG had been in practice for enough years to actually effect biological changes, because most research is actually far too short to show changes of this nature in dry environments. So it was very important to show right up front that if you'd practiced this for enough years and with the right background to specifically aim at improving the soil and soil function, that you got positive results. And that the first wave has now shown that in just about all the ecosystems that we've worked in. We can carry on doing a little bit of that in some of the areas that have not been covered that well. But the next step is to sit back and say, right, in any one of these different regions, do you get optimal results by doing things slightly differently to where they're done elsewhere? And testing hypotheses relating to that. One of the big things, for instance, is there's so much evidence now showing that if you've got a high fungal to bacterial ratio in the soil, then you get so many more positive things happening. And the soil microbiological work from around the world shows that that should be the case. But how you link that with what management to achieve the best results is it needs a bit of work still. So, and the other thing too is when you have multiple species of plants, you create multiple species of microbes, and that enhances your productivity. There's a synergism there that's huge. And these are all the things that need to be looked at more carefully, saying, okay, how do we actually change our management to get the best out of these partnerships between these different elements in the ecosystem?
While we're on the topic of research that's coming, I'm just to point out to folks, it appears that the chat showing on the screen is not working. The connection broke for some reason. My apologies. We are monitoring that, and so I've got multiple screens open, and the questions are being shared with me. So I'm going to do my best to multitask here and ask them to you, Richard. But I'm getting a question from someone. Asking, have your fellow Texas A&M colleagues become more accepting of your research over the years, or are they still convinced that AMP and holistic planned grazing make no difference whether compared to continuous grazing?
That's at the core of many of the problems we face today. Texas A&M is a traditional agricultural and industrial ag type organization. Mm-hmm. And that's carried across to even the management of rangelands. The problem with getting research that looks at the biology involved is that these institutions are funded from commercial entities that need to make money from products that they sell. So that's what gets the money in research. If you're looking at the biology to increase it, there are much less chances of doing that. But we've come to realize that by following the industrial model without thinking, the soil function has been rapidly decimated and continues to be decimated, and we have to address that. We have to say, we have to move away from something that destroys function and see what truly does actually build function. And fortunately, we've spent a bit of time in Washington talking to people up there, and the money is now available. The hot potato that's getting funded at the moment in agriculture is managing to improve soil health, to improve the whole agricultural system, including economic. So things are changing, but folks who grew up with the industrial model, they don't want to change very readily. And the answer is, to your question, there's only a handful of people who think the same way. That's why we've had to work with people from other institutions.
Well, it seems that pool of researchers is growing, if my perception of the literature is any gauge. And I'm actually seeing a question here coming in asking, are there any grad student opportunities of for researching AMP or holistic planned grazing? And then further, I know that with your vacancy at A&M, there is now a spot there. So perhaps here would be a good opportunity for you to chime in on what opportunities might lie there.
Yes, to get grad students, we need money. And those professors and who are currently working and heading in this direction, they've been recently successful with getting grants. So they have already started getting doctoral students, and in some cases postdocs, to actually carry on the research. So keep looking out, but go to the places where people have got a similar mindset and who want to look at the biology to improve the situation and move away from just carrying on destroying some of the ecosystem. Just keep looking out, and the numbers of people working in this arena are increasing.
And then the follow-up to that, with your retirement, there is a vacancy at A&M. Is that correct? I believe that you had mentioned there's potential opportunity for someone to come in there.
Despite what I've said about the majority of the university being locked into different ways of looking at things, they have recognized that we have made great strides here. And they've been given the go-ahead at the highest level to actually look for a person who's going to do the same kind of research that I've done. So if anybody's interested, or of anybody, get them to have a look at the announcement. It's going to be out shortly, and go for it.
Any particular criteria that you think would be best?
I was asked what criteria we should concentrate on, and I said, if people come from a traditional ag background, that's not the kind of person you're looking for. You need to look for somebody who's had a biological, ecological training in soil, microbes, watersheds, watershed function, biological function, coming from that background, and then partnering with people who are savvy in terms of management that will be required to actually achieve biological goals. That's what we're looking for. You need teams with that kind of mix to solve the problems that need to be worked on.
Great. All right, I'm going to move on to some more questions. Got another one asking, are we only increasing soil organic carbon levels, or are we also creating soil with holistic planned grazing? Do you measure in the studies the net creation or destruction of soils, for example, the increased depth of the soil? And if so, how do you measure it?
Good questions. We work in very dry environments, so the means of actually being able to measure such differences over even decades is fairly limited, and we have not tried that. I do know people up in the northeast with cooler and more moist environments who have done initial work that indicates that, yes, they are building soil as well. I know even people as dry as Gabe Brown, you can visibly see extra levels of of soil above the previous year's crop residue. So there's evidence there, but it's a thing that needs measuring carefully, and it's difficult, but it's very important.
So talking about dry environments, very brittle, and in the holistic management world, we talk about brittle versus non-brittle landscapes. For those that aren't as in depth in, their holistic management training, brittleness refers to the distribution of precipitation throughout the year. So you could live in an area that gets a lot of rain, but if it only happens in a certain portion of the year, you have a distinct growing season and a non-growing season. And that affects management choices, how you manage your land if you do not have a year-round growing season. It sounds like a lot of your research has been in brittle or brittle-leaning environments, but I'm seeing a question that says, "Fantastic, Richard, always insightful. Are you aware of any studies looking at this using sheep in non-brittle climates?" And I'd probably expand that to, most, or, not just sheep, but any type of ruminants in non-brittle climates. We're looking at research about that in New Zealand to build on what was implied in research in the 40s.
So in order to stay in touch with the people who are successful and to learn from them using holistic planned grazing, I'm constantly in touch with people who are making a lot of progress. And people who are running sheep in those kind of environments are amongst those producing the quickest and most substantial results. And of course, your sheep have a much wider array of plants that they actually select. So they are a very positive entity in the whole game. They are fantastic and I'm actually going to be moving in the sheep direction for those reasons. And they cash flow much better too. Higher fecundity, quicker turnover populations. They're just a more efficient species. They're great.
Well, you heard it here first. Sheep. Fan of Richard Teague is a fan.
The Kiwis have got some fantastic, and the Aussies too. They've got some fantastic people working on these things.
Yeah, for sure. What about I know there's a lot of academic debates where people will try to come at holistic management, holistic planned grazing, and say, this sounds all well and good, what you've presented here, but there's going to be a saturation point, or so that the soil will no longer be able to draw down any more carbon. Or what about the permanence of the carbon? It's not permanent in there, so carbon credits shouldn't matter. What do you say to those types of criticisms of the research, specifically the saturation point argument and the permanence argument?
That's a very good question. And when you think about things, we've all done basic science and stuff like that, and saturation is a fact with most things, and biology included. So most people refer back to the oldest study in this, and that's at Rothamsted in England. And they started looking at this over 100 years ago. And when you look at the way they constructed their research and conducted it, you gain insights into why they actually plateaued. So they started off by looking at, they weren't saying we want to manage in a way that maximizes carbon sequestration. They said we've got sheep grazing or cattle grazing, and in spring you have to move around and graze in an area to not get on top of the grass and let it come away. But then as you get into early summer, the grass starts getting away from the cattle. So the system that they did their research on would do sort of rotational grazing to begin with. And then they would not graze the whole area. They would cut a hay crop and sometimes a second hay crop in that same area because they needed hay for their wintering. So we know from all the work that's been conducted, if you cut and take off carbon material, you diminish the soil carbon. So that's the basic. You can go on the web and look at the detailed details of exactly how they managed it. So follow up and look at this. So then that's what they started with. And then because money became short, they started reducing the size of what they were doing. And eventually they got to the point where they had small little paddocks grazed by sheep, and then they stopped even grazing them by sheep. Then they would cut the grass to simulate grazing, take it off, they would measure it, and then put it back again. But now we know that it takes a whole variety of insects and soil microbia to make these soils functional. Dung beetles are some of the most potent things affecting the change. There are 14 species of dung beetles in Britain. By cutting and removing and not going through animals, you cut out that whole cadre. So Jonathan Lundgren, the entomologist, he's been working at this, and he's shown quite clearly that those dung beetles are like bulldozers. They shunt things around and move them around so that you increase infiltration and things like that. And a great diversity of smaller insects and microbes actually are facilitated by them to speed up nutrient cycling in particular, but also infiltration rates. So if they have managed there without having a grazer in it, surely they have compromised the original functionality. So my hypothesis is, and this is very testable, even though it will take a long time, is to say, right, what if we went back to those areas and reintroduced the grazers, made sure that all the components, the macro and micro elements were actually functioning well? Let's see what happens then. Let's see if there's plateauing off. So the observational data we've got to suggest that we don't know where that plateauing is comes from Saskatchewan and Alberta and North Dakota, where Neil Dennis had been and Gabe have been going for 14, 15 years, and their levels of organic carbon are still increasing. Now, we don't know how much of that is due to an increase in soil carbon alone, or if we truly are building soil. So there are environments that we've observed where both of those could be taking place. We just need to test it adequately. This is the kind of research that's really important.
There's a follow-up question on that one. Have you found an openness from other scientists into questioning the saturation point?
If they come from an ecological background, yes. Agriculturalists are taught different things. You know, it's quite interesting going back to the history of agriculture around about the Second World War. Prior to the Second World War, the Germans, the French, and the English, they knew how to manage the biology so it was sustainable, and they would build things up. And there are books that I was brought up on where they show you how all these things happen. And as soon as the chemical fertilizers became available, all the scientists working on those subjects said, you will kill the biology, and this is what's going to happen. And it's all the things we're measuring now, the degrading of the function of our soils. And it's the biological destruction with chemicals that actually is doing it. And that's what we've got to unravel and move in a better direction.
Love it. All right, we got time for a few more. And again, I see some questions coming in asking if this recording, if this live stream is being recorded. These live streams will continue to exist on Facebook and YouTube. Unfortunately, in whatever way Facebook and YouTube have saved them will be how they exist into the future. So apologies for the cutouts that may have happened on the different platforms throughout. We've been trying our best, but you know how technology goes at times. Got another question. Someone, Robin asks, as I write my thesis in this field, I've read also critics about HPG. I wanted to ask what your perception about the studies of research against HM, for example, David Brisky. So comments on, you know, the anti-holistic management folks and, you know, perhaps to expand on that a little bit in what might some of the shortcomings be from those critics, or you know what are their arguments and perhaps what are they missing?
So we've actually published on this. People can look at the Society for Range Management. I published a couple of papers pointing out the shortcomings of the Brisky et al. Approach, and essentially to sum it up is they do not manage, they think rotational grazing is the same as holistic planned grazing. It's very, very different. You have holistic planned grazing specifically only changes management to improve the soil function. Essentially, you have short grazing periods with long periods of recovery that allow your whole ecosystem to recover. The plants have deep roots, the fungal comes back and stuff like that. And the way the rotational grazing experiments by most agricultural scientists has been conducted doesn't even come close to that. And what they are in effect doing is they are rotationally overgrazing because they graze for too long and they don't give it a long enough rest. And then the way they use inorganic fertilizers exacerbates that because you're damaging the soil microbia, particularly the fungi, who are so important in facilitating water infiltration and retention and also nutrient cycling. So as soon as you damage those elements, your ecosystem is going like a six-cylinder engine on 3 cylinders. It's just not functioning properly. And it's just as well to sit down and follow the scientific method. The scientific method says, follow your hypothesis, but as soon as you find something that seems to be at odds with it, go and investigate how they arrived at that and what are the reasons for the differences that we created. Now, our papers specifically address those things, so they can start reading there. And then everybody has a different way they can look at things. Everybody can bring something to the table. So everybody needs to exercise their innovative thinking and say, okay, what other ways could this actually be different to achieve different goals with either HPG or simple rotational grazing? But the other big thing is scale. If you're operating at a scale that diminishes the patch degradation of a landscape, then you will not pick up the degradation that takes place. And we've published modeling papers and papers conducted at the scales in the field of experiments compared to those of, say, 10 times greater scale. There are huge differences merely because the animals impact differently at different scales.
So larger scale is needed in the research to see those differences, you're saying?
Correct.
It's interesting. I think back, in a previous life before I was in the ag space, I worked in medical devices. I actually used to design clinical trials and approve devices for the FDA. And there's an aspect of powering your trials, getting enough patients in a trial so that there is statistical relevance so that you can, see through the signal to noise ratio. And it's funny to think of that correlate here in terms of, like number of patients in a clinical trial or, number of acres or number of cows in terms of being able to see the differences in the impacts. I'd never thought of that before, but that's interesting.
This is good. And this is where you have to come back to research methodology.
Yeah.
The modeling is a very powerful tool because it allows you to investigate things that you couldn't actually investigate in the field. But you've got to combine the two together. And if your model doesn't show what's happening in the field, then there's something wrong with your model. So we've used them extensively, and we've hypothesized and tested the hypothesis on scale and the importance of changing the length of grazing with the length of recovery. As soon as you change those things, and each environment's going to be slightly different. In these tall grass prairie environments, you must have a short grazing period, but if you have it too long, then you go through to seeding, and the quality of your forage drops off markedly. So you might be growing a little bit more grass, but the quality is so poor that your animal performance goes off. So you've got to get a good balance, and every season changes. You've got to know what you're looking for. Unfortunately, there's some really good educators, the holistic management educators, the SI educators. Alan Williams and his team are absolutely outstanding in their working with farmers in the grass-fed and finished to actually really hone the skills needed to get more people able to get really good results.
No, that's great. And just, while we're there, just mentioning the educators, throughout the Savory Global Network, we've got Savory Hubs that all have educators that help folks learn holistic management. So if you are interested in learning holistic management or, consulting with someone, find your local Savory Hub. The link is there on the screen, savory.global/hubs. There was one last question. I lost it, but I wanted to call it out just because I know we're at the top of the hour. But someone was asking about EOV, so Savory's Ecological Outcome Verification Protocol. That's the piece that really powers our land to market program for verifying regenerative claims. They were wondering what your thoughts were about EOV and the potential that it can provide to producers, in terms of verifying regeneration claims or, entering ecosystem service markets. Do you have any thoughts about EOV?
Yes, I've been intimately involved with EOV since prior to its creation. And the people organized, like Pablo Borelli, absolutely first class. They know their subject. And the EOV is really a very wide spectrum of things that it covers, and it covers them extremely well. The only possible criticism would be that the amount of detail there would be a little bit daunting to some people. But in terms of efficacy and picking up exactly what's happening on the ground, it's first class. I'm involved as an external evaluator. I have nothing to gain from it. I just want something that's really good and functional, and this is it.
Well, we appreciate that, and it's something that brings a lot of excitement to us and our network. If folks want to learn more, got that website showing on the screen. Yeah, you're pointing to it somewhere in there.
No. I want to make a point.
Oh, you want to make a point? I thought you were pointing to the link on the screen. Go ahead, make your point, please.
Ever since before HP was started, I have been regularly attending meetings by holistic management people. And all the courses, I've attended all the courses, many 2 or 3 times, to stay in touch with the discipline. That is the way you learn, and you will not get it as good an education in it unless you go through those people that you mentioned.
Wonderful. Well, we're at the top of the hour, and with it being Earth Day, I know people have all kinds of different webinars and events to attend. I hope this was a bright spot in people's days. I know it was for me. Richard, any last parting words for the audience before we go?
No, thank you very much for the opportunity. Enjoyed it.
Yeah, same. It's been an absolute pleasure. And, again, from everyone throughout the Savory Global Network and the Savory Institute team, thank you for all the research you've done and for your continued advocacy, to demonstrate the improved ecological effects of holistic planned grazing. Thanks, Richard.